The glass shattered before I realized it was my voice. The room froze, and Lucas didn't flinch. He watched me like he'd planned this moment. He had. Unseal. I could feel the edges cutting through the air. "Tell me this isn't you," I said, trying to stitch breath into words. He smiled like a bruise and shrugged. "If you couldn't hold it, you never deserved it," Lucas said. And the crowd breathed in hard. My name on the screen blinked from winner to withdrawn. Ethan stepped toward me, panic in his eyes. "Maya, something's wrong in the system," he said. But I already knew. Nora hovered by the exit, torn between loyalty and fear. Emails I never sent. Deadlines I never missed. "You fed them," I said, feeling the floor tilt. Lucas said, "I corrected a mistake." Cameras fluttered like vultures circling. My throat burned with words I'd promised I'd never say. "You were my friend," I said, softer than glass dust. Lucas said, "You were my shadow." The music died. The stage lights roared. I felt the world split along a line he drew. They rolled back the footage like it could rewind the night, but the damage clung to every surface. Security ushered us to a side corridor where the air felt thinner. Ethan said, "I can prove those emails aren't yours," and I wanted to believe. The word believe felt dangerous in my mouth. Lucas waited at the far end, fiddling with his cufflink like a magician priming a trick. "You always loved the spotlight," he said, letting the echo do the rest. I remembered nights we practiced pitches together, trading courage like coins. Nora stepped between us, voice low. "Stop," she said, eyes hard. He smirked and looked past her. "This is what happens when you confuse luck for talent," Lucas said, and the corridor lights hummed like bees. I steadied myself against the wall, feeling the paint cool my palm. "You did this because you couldn't stand it," I said, and the floor held. The PR manager wanted statements, but I had none I trusted. Words felt like glass again. Ethan said, "Give me an hour," which sounded like hope on crutches. Lucas drifted near the catering table, breaking a macaron like it insulted him. "We both know you climbed on favors," he said, casual knives in his tone. I laughed, sharp and hollow. "We both know I outworked you," I said, and his jaw clenched. Nora's phone buzzed, the screen flashing a name we both recognized from the past. She went pale and tucked it away. "This isn't over," she whispered to me, which landed like a storm warning. Cameras peeked around the curtains, pupils hungry. I stood straighter than I felt. Somewhere, music started again, too cheerful for a crime scene. Undoing all. The night refused to end, and the truth wouldn't stay buried. In the quiet lounge, trophies lined a shelf like witnesses. I traced one with my eyes and felt heat coil in my chest. Ethan said, "Metadata shows edits from a device not yours," and relief flickered like a match. "Then strike it," I said, leaning in. He nodded, already tapping. Lucas sauntered in, slow and theatrical. "Even if they fix it, the stain stays," he said, savoring each word. I kept my voice level. "I can live with a stain. Can you live with yourself?" He looked at the trophies and smirked like he'd already renamed them. Nora closed the door, and the latch sounded final. "No more audience," she said. I stepped into the center of the rug that looked like a target. "You wanted my fall more than your win," I said. Lucas didn't deny it. The silence agreed for him. Security asked if I wanted him removed. I wanted the truth pinned to the wall instead. "No," I said, voice clear. "Let him watch this get undone." Ethan said, "I've got the trace," and pulled up the access trail like a fuse line. Lucas's smile faltered, then returned, thinner. "You think this clears you with everyone?" he said. "It clears me with myself," I said, and the words landed steady. Nora exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for months. Somewhere beyond the doors, the award returned to silence. "You could have asked for help," I said. Softer now. Lucas said nothing, which was louder. The night stretched, and the room held its breath with us. I didn't forgive. I didn't forget. I chose to stand. And to be seen standing. The silence after the confrontation clung to me like smoke, yet memory dragged me backward, to days when laughter filled the corners instead of suspicion. Lucas and I once sat on rooftops, sharing soda cans and daring each other to dream. "We'll own this city," he said, tapping his fist against mine under the glow of street lamps. I believed him, because belief felt effortless then. Ethan reminded me later, "You trusted him too much," but trust was the language of youth. We worked late nights in cafes, hunched over laptops, trading ideas like secrets. Nora sometimes joined us, sketching logos on napkins. I never imagined the sketches could become weapons. The present bled into the past, and the warmth felt cruel now. If loyalty had weight, it had rested on my shoulders all those years. Now it pressed down heavier than ever, making me wonder if I had carried it alone all along. There were afternoons when competition was a game, not a battlefield. I remembered the campus library where Lucas whispered jokes while we studied. "Whoever scores higher buys pizza," he said, flashing that grin I once trusted. We laughed even when one of us lost. Nora sat nearby, rolling her eyes at our antics, but I saw her smile too. Ethan visited sometimes, offering advice with calm patience, reminding us that rivalry could sharpen, not destroy. Those walls smelled of old books and ambition, carrying the echo of pencils scratching late into the night. Back then, success meant proving we belonged, not proving we could betray. I never thought envy could take root in the soil of those memories. Now, looking back, I wonder if the seed was already planted, hidden under every promise of friendship, waiting for the right storm to bloom. The memories kept circling, relentless. We once pitched our first project to a tiny cafe owner, hoping for sponsorship that never came. Lucas spoke with fire, hands cutting the air, while I filled the silence with facts. "We'll prove them wrong someday," I whispered when we left empty-handed. He nodded, determined, and in that moment we were unbreakable. Ethan clapped us on the back, proud, and Nora teased us for dreaming too big. The cafe smelled of burnt coffee and fresh bread, and I can still taste the failure that somehow tasted sweet then. We believed failure meant growth, not fracture. Now I know better. Growth for one can mean resentment for another. I held onto those nights like talismans, only to realize they were blades waiting to be turned against me. Somewhere in the past, loyalty was more than a word, it was action. When my father was in the hospital, Lucas stayed by my side, bringing me coffee I barely tasted. He said, "You don't have to carry this alone," and I believed him. I still see the sterile glow of hospital halls, his reflection in the glass as he walked with me. Nora held my hand that night, whispering comfort, while Ethan brought updates from doctors with calm steadiness. Those nights etched trust into my skin, permanent as ink. I never thought the same hand that steadied me would later push me toward the edge. Betrayal feels worse when it comes from the one who once caught you. The warmth of his past kindness feels now like the cruelest lie of all. The reel of memories refused to stop. I thought of the bonfire we built one summer, flames dancing higher than our futures. Lucas threw logs in with reckless joy, sparks flying in his grin. "This is forever," he said, raising his cup. I raised mine too, believing the promise written in firelight. Ethan laughed at our wild toasts, and Nora sang old songs under the stars. The air smelled of pine and smoke, the crackle of wood mixing with voices that carried dreams. I thought those nights made us unshakable. But forever is fragile, and fire burns both warmth and destruction. Looking back, I wonder if the flames hid shadows I refused to see. Trust felt eternal then, but eternity ended sooner than I imagined, and the ashes still cling to me. Morning arrived like a verdict, and the inbox bloomed with rumors dressed as facts. I skimmed the headlines and felt old promises sour on my tongue. Ethan said, "The trail leads to a shared drive," and his voice carried flint. I thought of handshake vows that once felt unbreakable. Lucas posted a smiling photo, the caption sweet as poison. Nora called breath tight. People are asking if you cheated, she said, and the walls leaned closer. I told her the truth, plain and heavy, and she listened like a door deciding to open. We will need proof, Ethan said. And the word we steadied me. I stared at the screen until the pixels seemed to hiss. I had built my name brick by patient brick. Now someone was kicking at the foundation. I would not let the dust be my story. Not today. Not ever. By noon the whispers had shape, and shape is what fear loves. A vendor canceled a meeting with an apology that felt rehearsed. We heard you inflated metrics, the email said, and my stomach dropped clean through me. Ethan muttered, "Ghost edits on the archive," and tapped faster. I paced the corridor and counted my breaths until they sounded like marching feet. Lucas appeared at the far end, crisp and casual, offering a nod that tasted like smoke. "Tough break," he said, keeping his hands in his pockets as if truth was lint. I kept my voice even, and let it carry. I told him it would end with evidence brighter than his charm. He smirked and turned away like a curtain falling. Nora arrived with printouts, edges sharp as winter. "Start here," she said, and the paper cut my thumb. It felt like a signature. We set up in the small war room, where the air smelled of dry erase ink and urgency. Ethan mirrored the drive and sifted through version histories like an archaeologist. "Here," he said, and a timestamp blinked like a lighthouse. An external session had nudged numbers at midnight. Nora traced the access path and circled a username that felt too neat. I felt heat rise in my throat but held it down. Lucas sent a message to the group chat about integrity and gratitude. The words rang hollow as a stage prop die. I typed nothing, because silence sometimes roars. "Chain of custody is the key," Ethan said, and the phrase became a rope. We pulled on it together, and something on the other end tugged back. That was the first moment I knew this would not be quick. It would be exact. The first partner to blink was the one who once sent cupcakes when we hit milestones. They asked for a pause while they evaluated optics. I tasted frosting and ash. I called and kept my voice calm enough to cross the bridge. They hedged with careful phrases that folded into each other. When the call ended, the room hummed like a bad dream. Nora said, "We need a statement that is quiet and sharp," and I nodded. Ethan compiled a brief, each line a step on black ice. I remembered Lucas telling me that appearance is half the game. I had believed that substance wins the other half. Now even substance needed armor. I approved the draft and felt the ground firm a little. If a storm waits, you do not beg the sky. You fasten the shutters and count your strengths. Dusk folded the city into darker questions, and the office lights felt like lonely stars. A new thread appeared on a forum, repeating the lie with fresher teeth. Ethan said, "I can trace the seed account," and hope steadied on its elbows. I stood by the window and watched taillights braid down the avenue. Nora touched my arm and said, "You are not alone." And the simplest words did the heaviest lifting. I drafted one more note for the partners, plain and precise. I chose facts over thunder and clarity over heat. Lucas posted again, a polished smile with a caption about resilience. I let it drift past me like a cold wind. The truth was slow, but it was coming with boots on. I set my phone down and gave the night my full attention. The truth arrived not as thunder but as a whisper with teeth. Ethan discovered the login key tied to Lucas's personal device, a signature too sharp to deny. "It's him," Ethan said, voice flat as iron. I felt the ground tilt beneath me and steady again in the same breath. Nora pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief and recognition. I thought of the rooftop nights, the bonfire promises, the hospital corridors. They all collapsed into this single frame. Betrayal confirmed. Lucas walked into the room like he owned the air. "Looking for villains?" he asked, smiling. I stared at him. The answer carved across his face already. "I don't need to look," I said. For the first time, silence served me more than words. The evidence glowed on the screen, bright and final. Lucas leaned against the doorframe, unbothered. "You're chasing shadows," he said, tone dripping with arrogance. Ethan turned the screen toward him, timestamps glaring like floodlights. His smirk faltered, just slightly, but enough to be caught. "You forged my trail," he said, reaching for excuses, but Nora cut in sharp. "No one else had this access," she said. I stepped closer, each word pulling threads loose. "Why?" I asked, steady and low. He shrugged, but his silence told louder stories. The betrayal was no longer speculation. It was flesh, bone, and evidence, standing right in front of me, with eyes that had once promised forever. The office fell into stillness heavy enough to crack. Lucas broke it with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You think this makes you stronger?" he asked, voice brittle. I answered with a memory. "We built this together. You tore it apart." Ethan's hands moved fast across the keyboard, securing files before they could vanish. Nora's shoulders squared, her loyalty shifting in final silence. Lucas threw his hands up. "They'll believe what they want," he snapped. His mask had slipped, and the bitterness underneath was raw. I let him taste his own words, and gave none back. Sometimes the deepest wound is delivered without a blade. Lucas moved closer, words sharpening with each step. "You never deserved what you got," he hissed. I met his glare with something harder. "I earned it," I said, steady as stone. Ethan pulled up a trail of forged documents, line after line, a mirror of deceit. Nora whispered, "All those nights, all those promises," her voice breaking at the edges. Lucas' jaw clenched as though truth itself burned. He looked like the boy I once knew, and the man I now faced merged into a stranger. My pulse steadied, not in fear but in clarity. I realized betrayal doesn't just end trust, it ends the version of yourself that believed so blindly. The moment cracked wide open when Lucas slammed his fist on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot, startling even him. Ethan froze mid-keystroke, and Nora flinched. I didn't move. "You think you'll win?" Lucas shouted. His voice was louder than the truth, but not stronger. I spoke softly, and that softness cut sharper than his rage. "You already lost when you betrayed me." His eyes flickered, a storm fighting to break free. But the evidence lay heavy on the screen, undeniable, immovable. For the first time, his silence didn't feel like control. It felt like surrender. And in that silence, I reclaimed the ground beneath me. The board summoned us at dawn, and the room felt colder than the hour. Lucas sat across from me, polishing his watch like he could polish the truth. Ethan said the audit files were sealed, and his voice cut clean. Nora placed the summary on the table, and the pages whispered like witnesses. Lucas said, "You're making a spectacle," but the word spectacle already belonged to him. I answered that facts don't perform, they endure. He smiled, thin as wire, and asked who would believe a tidy trail over a charming face. Ethan said, "Belief bends when evidence refuses to." Nora said reputation is a mirror that remembers the hand that cracked it. I felt my spine find its edge, and I let silence work like fire. The air carried the weight of endings. Questions hit like hail, and the panel wanted clean answers, not weather reports. I kept mine spare and exact, letting the paper trails speak. Lucas said I engineered a trap, and the word trap rang cheap. Ethan walked them through each edit like stepping stones that refused to sink. Nora added the context of access tiers, and the room tilted toward clarity. Lucas laughed, but the laugh slipped on its own ice. I told the board the work mattered more than any of us. He scoffed, and the sound landed flat. The chair thanked us, and the gratitude tasted procedural. We were excused, but the verdict had already started writing itself. The hallway outside felt like a pressure valve just before it breaks. Lucas closed the distance and lowered his voice like a blade. He said I owed him my rise, and the debt was past due. I told him I owed him honesty, and I had paid that in full. Ethan stepped closer, and his presence turned the air safer. Nora warned Lucas to stop, and her tone left no room. He said the city loves a scandal more than a correction. I said the city also loves a comeback built on stone. His jaw knotted, and the mask slipped again. We stood there, 4 people, and a choice that had already been made. Security approached, called by someone who feared truth in a raised voice. The lead asked if everything was all right, and the question dangled like a test. Lucas said we were done, yet his hands still shook. I said we were almost finished, and the word finished landed heavy. Ethan handed the officer a brief note describing the tampered files. Nora documented badge scans that mapped to a single profile. Lucas stared at the floor as if it might open and swallow the moment. I felt no triumph, only a clean edge where confusion had lived. The officer nodded, and the room gave back our air. The confrontation finally burned to its last ember in the atrium's open echo. Lucas said, "You'll never be the same," and I agreed, but not how he meant. I said, "I will be clearer," and the word clearer felt like armor. Ethan exhaled, the first real breath of the day. Nora squeezed my hand, and the gesture stitched something steady. Lucas turned to leave, and his reflection trailed him like a question that wouldn't answer. I did not chase him, because some stories end by letting the door close. The city beyond the glass moved on, and I chose to move with it. The storm had spent itself, and I was still standing. The echoes of the boardroom still clung to me when I walked through the city streets that night. Every reflection in the glass towers looked like Lucas's shadow, lingering, refusing to vanish. Ethan stayed by my side, saying the evidence now stood stronger than reputation. Nora carried silence, but her presence felt like an anchor. I replayed Lucas's words, the venom wrapped in familiarity, and it struck me that grief for a friendship can feel heavier than rage. I whispered to myself that betrayal doesn't erase worth, it only reveals it. Ethan said, "You're not broken, Maya, you're scarred, and scars are proof you heal." Nora added softly, "The truth belongs to you now." I nodded, the night air cool against my face, realizing the storm had passed, but the wreckage still needed to be walked through. The following morning, I faced the mirror longer than usual. My reflection carried exhaustion but also clarity. The betrayal had carved something unasked but undeniable. A harder edge where there once was only trust. Ethan's email pinged with confirmations, partners choosing to stand firm now that the smoke cleared. Nora knocked gently on the door, holding coffee with both hands, as if offering steadiness itself. She said, "You survived the storm, now write what comes after." I smiled faintly, though it felt fragile. Lucas had tried to cut me down, but he hadn't killed what rooted me. The mirror whispered that identity can't be stolen by lies. It can be bruised, but it waits beneath, patient for its turn to shine again. Later in the office, the whispers had changed tone. Where once there had been suspicion, now there was curiosity and a quiet kind of respect. Ethan showed me a list of endorsements, renewing with signatures unshaken. He said, "Proof may be slower than lies, but it lasts longer." Nora added, "People remember who stands tall when it costs the most." I walked past Lucas's empty desk. His chair turned slightly as though he'd left in haste. It struck me that absence can be louder than presence when it's stained by guilt. I paused, then kept moving, because forward was the only direction worth carrying. The air smelled of coffee, ink, and second chances. That evening we gathered in the quiet cafe where everything once began. The same smell of burnt coffee lingered, but it tasted different now. Ethan raised his cup and said, "To survival." Nora smirked and said, "To resilience." I lifted mine and said, "To truth." The clink of porcelain sounded less like celebration and more like closure. I remembered sitting here years ago with Lucas, both of us brimming with impossible dreams. The ghost of that night flickered in the corner of my mind, but it didn't hold power anymore. Memories can't be erased, but they can be outgrown. As the steam curled from my cup, I felt lighter, as though the weight was finally shifting to where it belonged, off my shoulders and onto the pages of the past. When I finally walked home, The city lights shimmered like promises waiting to be rewritten. The betrayal had ended the friendship, but not my story. Ethan's words replayed, "Scars prove healing," and I let them settle into me like a seed. Nora's presence, her steady hand, reminded me not all bonds fracture. Lucas was gone, a ghost haunting his own choices now. I whispered to the night, "You cannot cut down roots you did not plant." The wind carried it away, and the city kept breathing. Betrayal had scarred me, but dignity had restored me. And though the wound would always remain, I was no longer defined by what I lost, but by what I chose to hold on to. Morning arrived with a quiet that felt earned. Emails came back steady and clean, like breaths after a sprint. Ethan said, "Partners confirmed renewals," and the words landed like anchors. Nora smiled and said, "You kept the truth sharper than their noise." I walked the office and felt the floor return to me. Lucas's name floated through a few hushed corners, then faded. I didn't chase it. I let the day be small and honest. "We rebuild by doing, not declaring," I said, and the team nodded. The storm had a past now. I had a future. By noon I drafted a message for the team, spare and exact, thanking them for holding the line. Ethan said, "Say less and mean more," and I trimmed the rest. Nora added one sentence about standards that do not bend. We pressed send, and let the room exhale. A ping arrived from an old client who had watched in silence. Proud to continue, the note read. I closed my eyes and let relief be quiet. Lucas had chosen spectacle. I chose substance. "We move," I said, and the word felt like a door unlocking. That evening we met the vendor who had paused in fear. I spoke in facts, not thunder. Ethan walked through the audit with quiet precision. Nora said, "You can judge us by what we did when tested." The vendor listened, then closed their notebook. "We return," they said, and the word stitched a seam. On the way out, I passed a poster about integrity that once felt like decor. Tonight it felt like instruction. "We are not our wounds," I said, and the lobby lights hummed like agreement. Later, I stood on the old rooftop where promises once glittered. The city breathed below, unchanged and completely different. Ethan said, "You proved the work," then let silence finish the thought. Nora leaned on the rail and said, "Some endings are mercies." I looked at the skyline and released the last thread. "Thank you for standing when it counted," I said. And they didn't deflect it. The wind lifted the quiet into something almost like peace. I let it settle. On my walk home, a message arrived from an unknown address. It was one line from Lucas without apology. "You won," it said, like a wound that refused to heal itself. I stopped at the river and watched the lights break and mend on the water. Ethan's voice echoed, not in sound but in steadiness. Nora's hand squeeze lived in memory. I typed no reply. Some endings are not conversations. I breathed in the cold and chose a final sentence that belonged only to me. "You didn't cut me down," I said. "You revealed my roots."